And that's what climate change is about. It is literally, not figuratively, a clear and present danger.
We are in the beginning of a mass extinction.
The ability of CO2 to do the heavy work of creating a climate catastrophe is almost nil at this point.
The price of oil has been artificially elevated to the point of insanity.
That's not how you power a modern industrial system.
The ultimate goal of this renewable energy, plan is to reach the exact same point that we're at now.
You know who's tried that? Germany. 7 straight days of no wind for Germany. Their factories are shutting down.
They really do act like weather didn't happen prior to 1910.
Today is Friday.
That's right, Greta, you irrelevant pint-sized protester. It is Friday, and this is our own personal Friday protest, the Climate Realism Show, episode 117, 10 questions climate doomers can't or won't answer. Have you ever noticed that when it comes to inconvenient, hard facts, climate alarmists either revert to calling you a shill for big oil or just simply block you because they don't have the skills or knowledge to refute your factual challenge? Well, we've got a list of 10 very inconvenient questions that they refuse or can't answer. And Chris Marks, a meteorologist student who has been successfully pushing back climate alarm on Twitter, so much so that he's been blocked by Michael Mann, is going to be joining us. He's the author of those questions. And we'll look at some of the claims and inconvenient facts related to the West Coast heat wave this week. I'm your host, Anthony Watts, Senior Fellow for Environment and Climate at the Heartland Institute. Joining me today is Dr. H. Sterling Burnett, Director of the Robinson Center on Climate at the Heartland Institute, and Linnea Lueken, Research Fellow at Heartland, and of course, Chris Marks. Welcome, guys. Happy Friday.
Happy
Friday.
Happy day after Independence Day.
Yes.
Yeah, I was about to say we have so many British people in the chat today. The British are coming and we're being invaded.
Well, what's happened? Yeah, what's happened is they think this political situation might be better here in the aftermath of the Labor government's ascension. I'm fairly sure at this stage they'd be disappointed.
Right.
We still have the stumbler, bumbler, hair sniffer in chief in office.
Yep. So one of the crazy climate news features this week that we usually do this every week. This one kind of interesting because Google reveals a 48% increase in greenhouse gas emissions, largely driven by data center energy demands. Translation: AI. The expansion of AI is causing more greenhouse gases. So what are they going to do about that? Especially since Google makes, all these climate pledges and so forth. It's one of the most interesting things to me. And Chris, I don't know if you've ever been there or not, but the NCAR Supercomputing Center is actually located in Wyoming. And the reason it's in Wyoming rather than in Boulder, Colorado, where NCAR is because they can power that big monster up there on low-cost coal-driven electricity. It's really hypocritical. But, what are they going to do? Guys, what do you think?
They're going to keep growing their emissions, and they're going to demand more renewable, reliable power. As they say, public relations, we got to fight climate change. Reality, we got to have as much reliable energy as possible. And if we have to keep coal, nuclear, and natural gas open to do it, then so be it.
Yeah.
But probably just for them, though.
Well, yeah, that's right. Energy for we, not for thee. They're more than happy to shutter, have blackouts for the average folks, so long as their data centers don't shut down, because everyone knows that life didn't go forward before we had artificial intelligence and server farms.
Yeah. So server farms, unlike regular farms, produce CO2 rather than re-ingest it. Oh, well. Okay. So this is interesting. The world's largest floating solar power plant, located on India's Narmada River, is in ruins because bad weather happened. Wasn't it supposed to be that if we use solar panels and clean energy, the bad weather would not happen? Isn't that the deal?
I thought so.
Who thinks this stuff up? I mean, where was the engineer in the middle of all this?
That's what I'm wondering is hold it. in India, they have something called the monsoon season every year. Every year. And so that's where you're going to build a floating solar farm? Just someone was asleep at the wheel. No, someone wasn't asleep at the wheels. What they said is we can get subsidies, lots and lots of big green subsidies from the Indian government if we build a floating solar farm. And if it's damaged, we can go back to the Indian government to fix the problem.
Yeah, it's something else. You know, that every one of these, it seems like every one of these schemes for clean energy has some kind of a crazy component to it. And this is it. I mean, floating solar panels on the river. What could go wrong?
Yeah. Chris, you were going to say
there was
something?
A 350 megawatt solar farm in Texas that was destroyed by a hailstorm back in March.
Yep. That's in, well, relative to you, it's in my region. I'm in Texas, but still, Texas is a big state. It's pretty far away. But yeah, no, just solar panels damaged everywhere. It happens every year. You know, we get hail on the rooftops here in my region where people have rooftop solar, or we get tornadoes, even worse, by the way. It gives the winds one more lever to pull your roof off when they get up under the solar panels. It's stupidity, and it's venal. It's venal stupidity. It's all about the money that governments are willing to throw into these boondoggles.
Yeah,
Yep.
it's any power plant can get damaged by severe weather, but the difference with solar in particular, but also wind too, is that these resources are distributed out over the landscape wider, so you have more possibilities of hitting something critical when it's spread out all over the in this case the big bay here, instead of having one concentrated power plant where if it gets a unlucky hit, well, that's unfortunate, but out here they're everywhere, so anytime any weather happens, something is going to be destroyed.
Well, I mean, this is a wreck, and my second question is, unfortunately, India's rivers aren't known for being the cleanest already. I'm wondering what kind of pollution this caused and how you clean up shattered solar panels sunk to the bottom into the sand. What will be the long-term impact on human health and wildlife? I just can't believe it's good when you know what kind of chemicals and minerals and materials are in these solar panels.
You don't need much intelligence to see what could go wrong. That's for sure.
Well, you'd think.
Yeah. All right, let's move on to the cartoons for this week. Now, this is not a cartoon, but it probably should be. This is from the ever-reliable Babylon Bee. Liberal and private jet is upset as he looks down and sees all the cows causing climate change. Yeah, methane.
Methane.
And it's true, too. I mean, a lot of these liberals are just looking at flyover country as something that needs to be managed, They don't realize the importance of things like agriculture and ranching. Those are just things to be managed, according to them.
They know that their milk comes from the grocery store in little cartons, and their meat as well, if they're not eating bugs, right? I suspect even if they're eating bugs, they're not out there harvesting them themselves, picking up the cockroach on the ground outside, or the doodle bug, or whatever they're eating. So they just think these things come prepackaged like manna from heaven.
Yeah. So our next cartoon is kind of it's actually an oldie but goodie. This is from 2012, but it's still relevant today because of all of the nonsense associated with the heat waves. It's not the heat, it's the stupidity. It really is. I mean, Chris, you've debunked a lot of these heat wave myths, and claims. And these folks just don't want to look at this data. They just don't want to look at it because it just totally blows their mindset. Well, how could it be hotter in the past? Global warming is the thing of the present. It couldn't have been hotter in the past, right?
It's really insane listening to these people, and they're completely. You can tell them that it's the extreme number of, the number of hot days in the United States that are over 95 degrees was about over 18% lower in the 60-year period, 1961 to 2020, than it was in 1901 to 1960. And that's from the Global Historical Climatology Network data. I performed those calculations myself and did a percent decrease based on the 60-year intervals. And while it's a little bit, if you move to the 19, they always like to claim that the 1930s are an outlier. They say that, oh, that was just a dust bowl, and that was caused by some farmer in Kansas driving his John Deere Waterloo boy. But let me tell you something: the Dust Bowl was enhanced by agricultural practices. I don't deny that, especially in the Great Plains. But New York City recorded their highest temperature in July of 1936. That was not caused by some farmer in Iowa plowing his fields or destroying prairie grasses. The Greenland ice sheet surface mass balance was similarly low during the 1920s and 30s as it is today. Arctic ice was also anomalously low for the time. It's lower now in terms of extent and volume than it was then, but it was still anomalously low during that time. And a lot of this is modulated by oceanic multidecadal oscillations like the PDO or AMO. But even if you remove the 1930s, which were the bowl itself was probably forced by sea surface temperatures, a warm North Pacific and perpetual La Niñas. There's peer-reviewed literature on this. There's several studies that investigate this. We just enhanced it slightly locally, but it was warm across all of North America and even into Europe, in the Arctic at that time, from the data that we have. But other point is that even if you remove the 1930s, you still had some of the worst heat waves in the 1920s, the 1910s, and the 1950s. So what's their explanation for that?
Yeah, good point, Chris. Good points. And, the fact that you keep making these points, which are sensible, backed up by data, backed up by science, is irritating a lot of people. In particular, the irritated in chief, Michael Mann, who said in a tweet last week that Chris Marks is the Matt Walicki of Joe Bastardes. What a compliment. I mean, it doesn't take much to piss off Mann, but when you're starting to do facts, well, he can't have that. And why did Mann get upset? Well, it's because Chris put up this graph or this chart showing the United States. And he made some waves. And he said, this is awesome in the B. Not the B, actually. They published this, but this thing went viral last week because he was saying very correctly that, oh my God, the heat wave up towards New York, it's climate change. But that stuff over in flyover country in Montana, that's just weather, right? That's how they view this stuff. And
well, unless it's
insane. They completely ignore. What were you saying?
Unless
anyway,
it's winter. I was saying unless it's winter and they can pretend like it's climate change causing the polar vortex or whatever, then it's climate change. Also.
It's always the polar vortex during the wintertime. They claim that the jet stream is getting wavier due to the polar vortex, melting sea ice, the reduced latitudinal thermal gradient. They claim that then cold weather is caused by climate change, but that violates the second law of thermodynamics. There's no observations in our actual thermometer that even indicate that we're seeing more frequent cold waves. It's just they blame everything on climate change. You can look up climate change and insert your favorite topic, and you'll come up with I saw an article in Fox News a couple of years ago that said bread causes global warming.
Well, and we covered an article last week, one of the stupidest research papers I've ever heard of. I mean, and mind you, I've seen a lot of really, really stupid research papers. But this was like how climate change affects language in Parliament or something like that. They looked at all these speeches given evidently at nighttime or daytime in Parliament, I forget, but thousands of speeches, and climate change is evidently changing how people speak. The conclusion outraged me less than the fact that I suspect there's a lot of government dollars that went into that research. In any case, it got published.
Okay.
Just stand in line with their hands held out, waiting for a grant.
Yeah.
Anyway, so here's some of the stories that have been circulating this week about the California heat wave. Instead of now being in New York, the heat wave's over on the Pacific coast, and now that's driven by climate change, whereas last week it was cool, right? And it was just weather. Climate change is the driving force behind the Bay Area's extended heat wave, experts say. And then the next headline says, extreme heat waves aren't just summer. How climate change is heating up the weather and what we can do about it. Right, yeah. Let's go get a tax or something. That'll fix it. And then, of course, the California heat wave, climate change is fueling hotter nights. Well, I take exception with this because due to my surface station project, I've proven quite conclusively that the localized UHI microsite effects are bringing up the temperature at night, not climate change, not CO2. CO2 has a small impact, no doubt. But, I mean, in places like Las Vegas, for example, you can see a massive increase in the overnight temperatures. The high temperatures are flat. And of course, the low temperatures are being driven by the fact that there's so much extra infrastructure. I mean, if you visited Las Vegas 30 or 40 years ago, there was half of the stuff there that there is now, you know, and now they've added all these new hotels, parking lots, trams, I mean, everything. And so they're still measuring the temperature at McCarran Airport just off the strip, but everything's building up around McCarran Airport. And so we get all of this solar radiation absorption material, asphalt, concrete, all the solar radiation goes into that during the day. It releases it at night, and that brings the overnight low temperature up. And so, of course, you know,
of course, what's true of Vegas and parts of California, like Los Angeles and, well, every major city there, is true of Phoenix and Delhi, India, and all those locations that have grown dramatically, as shown by Roy Spencer and John Christie at UAH with their paper on the urban heat island effect,
right?
And urban density. As it grows, so does the heat.
All right. So, you know, the interesting thing about this heat wave the interesting thing about this heat wave is in California that they're talking about the extended high temperatures, the number of days of high temperature, and that's being, you know, caused by the heat wave. Well, Chris put together this wonderful little graph a few minutes before we went on air, and it shows California's average number of days per year with a maximum temperature greater than 105 degrees between 1895 to 2023. Of course, we don't have all the 2024 data in yet, but interesting thing here is you can see a clear wave pattern going on here. And what's the biggest influence on California's temperature? The ocean. My friend Jim Goodridge, former state climatologist of California, said he could determine what kind of temperatures are going to be happening over the next year just by simply looking at one buoy out in the ocean and determining its temperature, because he could see a strong correlation. So here we go. We've got a number of days back around 1915 and 1934 where temperatures were at or above 105 degrees for 16 or more days. Now we've got some in the present as well. But so what's unusual about it? How could these kinds of heat wave last for 16 days or more in the past without carbon dioxide? How could that happen, Chris?
Yeah, it's interesting I thought there would actually be a bit larger increase in hot days in California, because one thing you always hear about from the climate alarmists is that the desert Southwest is warming. You know, they say that, well, it is cooling in the east. They'll admit that if you press them hard enough, but they'll say, well, the desert Southwest is warming. But when I actually did an analysis of the entire GHCND station network in the United States a couple of years ago, and I need to update the charts, and I'm trying to figure out how to do it by coding to make it easier, because I did it by hand. I didn't have the Python skills I have now. But long story short, what I found is that most of the stations in the Southwest, if you're trying to find good, long-term, coherent station data where there's like less than 30 missing days per year, it's very, very difficult to do that, because most of the stations there that have that data are very much urbanized. There's very few stations in Arizona or New Mexico or Utah or even parts of parts of California that are hard to find. That California is much better, but even then, you also have the problem with a lot of these stations closing. Because when I did this analysis a couple years ago, I did a similar chart for California. It looks pretty much the same, but I used 48 stations, and several of them aren't reporting data anymore. But the trend's fairly the same with this data. But right now, we're not seeing any more extreme. The extreme heat has increased, in terms of the daily highs since the 1980s. That's true. But it's not any higher now than it was in the 1920s and 1930s. And this particular heat wave we're seeing in California this week is actually less. It was hotter in the same around the same weeks in 1905, 1908, 1913, 1921, I think, and certainly 1960, 1991, and even as recently as 2021, it was hotter. So that's interesting to note, and they're claiming this heat's unprecedented. But another thing that's really interesting is that they always want to reject the 134-degree reading in Death Valley, because that's been big news. But I did an analysis on that in last summer, and I redid it this year. I posted it again. I looked at taking their claim that the 134-degree reading in Death Valley is not valid, is that the nearest station, which was in Independence, California at the time, only registered, I think, 103 degrees that day. But if you take the elevation difference between the two sites and you do the dry adiabatic lapse rate, you get to a temperature of about, I think, 125 degrees. So it's 9 degrees off the 134-degree reading. So that might raise questions about it. However, in 2021 or 2020, I think it happened both times, they got to 130 degrees, and that is what climate alarmists claim is the most reliable temperature record. It was 130 degrees from August 2020, and I think in 2021. And now, while there's more stations in Death Valley now to corroborate that reading, if you just kind of do for quality control, ignore those stations in that part of California, you look at this nearest station, you look at Independence, California again. Now, that station closed in 2018, but there's another station nearby, and it's just a little bit higher in elevation, and they had data for that day. It was only 99 degrees that day that Death Valley was 130. So if you take the dry adiabatic lapse rate and apply it to that, you come up to like 112 degrees or something. So it's even more off. There's even a larger difference between that station near Independence and Death Valley. So if you're trying to use that argument, it's not very valid. Death Valley, there's a big microclimate there. It's much hotter than the surrounding areas by several degrees all the time. And anybody that lives in California can tell you that. I think that they want to discredit that record, even though it's SANS by the World Meteorological Organization and NOAA. They want to discredit it because it kind of goes against their alarmist narrative.
One of the most interesting things about high temperature records and temperature records in general is where you put the thermometer. And of course, we've discovered that a lot of thermometers are next to artificial heat sources and so forth. I just learned that last month in Los Angeles, they are moving the official thermometers, the station of record, from its location near UCLA further inland. And they actually issued a notice from the National Weather Service. It's a public notice. They're moving it inland to be more representative of city temperatures, because there was too much cooling breeze coming from the ocean, right? So what are we going to see now out of Los Angeles? We're going to see hotter temperatures, no two ways about it, because they've moved the station. And of course, the dumb people out there, the people that just don't pay attention to such facts, are going to say, well, it's climate change. Los Angeles is getting hotter. Look at that. It's much hotter than it was 2 years ago. Malarkey. Anyway, Chris also
Los Angeles is actually being spared from the worst of this heat wave.
So, Chris, you put together another really cool graph. This shows the average annual excess deaths due to non-optimal temperatures by region, 2000 to 2019. Last 20 years is approximately. But the interesting thing about this is that they're screaming in the media a lot about, climate-related deaths due to heat waves. But see, here's the deal. If you look at North America and compare it to Asia, interesting. It's very, very low for heat deaths. And that's usually with people that don't have the means to keep themselves cool, such as the elderly or the people that are indigent, that are living on the streets and so forth. But most of the deaths in North America are due to cold. And the same pattern holds true in every region of the world, especially in Asia. Cold deaths outnumber warm deaths by almost an order of magnitude. And so what's up with that?
Yeah, well, cold, cold kills about over 9.4 times over the 20-year period, 2000 2019. Cold moderate to extreme cold weather related deaths, it's like hypothermia or whatever, that killed over 9.4 times as many people globally on average per year than did moderate to extreme heat. There's no doubt that extreme heat's deadly. I mean, when you have a heat wave, of course, you want to stay inside and as much as you can. Even in areas like the Central Valley of California, where it gets up to 110 every summer, it's still hot. And I'm not going to deny that heat's deadly. I mean, you want to stay hydrated. You don't want to leave your pets outside. But the fact of the matter is, now some guy tried fact checking one of my posts on that previous temperature graph because he said I was downplaying the extreme heat. He said that he's denying this and he's denying the heat's deadly. And I'm like, dude, I posted yesterday in a separate post that yes, stay inside. I didn't advocate to go running outside, frolicking around in the heat. I didn't say that. I'm just talking about from a climate standpoint that this is not unprecedented and that we're seeing the heat that we see now is no different than it was really a century ago. But either way, yes, heat kills people, but cold kills far more people than does extreme heat or moderate heat. It's just a fact. That's just what the data shows from this 2021 study, which I pulled this data from and I graphed it by region. And
let's be clear.
The thing is people, the elderly and the people that are homeless as well die from. I mean, that's a large part of why this is, because they don't have the technology to stay warm. They don't have heating.
Let's be clear though. It's not just that heat kills per se, or cold kills per se. A lot pertains to natural background conditions for the people, what they're used to. So we know that this past year in the Hajj, during the Hajj, a lot of people died from heat. The heat wasn't unusual for the Hajj. But most of those people that died weren't from the region, so they weren't used to the heat. I would wager that there are a few native Alaskans, Athabascans, Aleut Eskimos that die from cold every year, despite it being extremely cold, because their bodies, their communities are acclimated to those conditions. So it is in part people who aren't acclimated to the region. I mean, let's face it, Saudi Arabia is going to have a spike in heat-related deaths this year. Well, gosh, it counts against Saudi Arabia. It counts against that region. But when 70% of them are from outside that region on the Hajj, it's sort of, well, that's like saying in South Dakota, there's the Sturgis, South Dakota, where they have a big motorcycle rally every year. And during the motorcycle rally, deaths go up. And so Sturgis per 100,000 people has a high rate of murder. Well, it's not that Sturgis is particularly dangerous. It's that it's like for 2 weeks, you got a lot of people there who are prone to violence, or more prone to violence than average, and they result in deaths. And that counts against Sturgis, but it doesn't mean Sturgis is the most violent place in the United States.
Wow. Yeah. So I want to bring up this next graph. This is from the Environmental Protection Agency. This is on their webpage that talks about, climate impacts of heat waves and so forth. Now, this is interesting because this is a heat wave index graph, and we also have this over at climateataglance.com. But this heat wave index shows clearly for the United States, the 1930s were the hottest. They were the longest stretch of extended heat waves ever. And in the present, not so much. But here's the interesting thing. Here's an official government cherry pick to hide inconvenient data. When you look at the next graph, they have also on the same page that shows the heat wave frequency. Look at this. The 1960s through the 2020s is displayed, but what happened to the 1930s? It's gone. Why? Well, because if they put the 1930s there, it would dominate all of these graphs, and they don't want that. So they just cherry picked it. And this is how you lie with graphs.
Yeah, I actually pointed out to people. Somebody replied to me with that 4-panel chart from the EPA, and a lot of these charts, these kind of more cherry-picked charts, have come in under the Biden administration. I have noticed that, which is interesting. And that heat wave index chart is kind of hidden now. It's not on the front like it used to be, if I recall correctly from visiting the site the other day. It's interesting. Now, somebody replied to me with this. They said, I got you. Heat waves are increasing. I said, well, dude, we have temperature data going back to 1895 at least, and in many cases back to the 1870s. And if you really want to press me, I can pull up fort data going back to 1821 because I have access to that from the National Climatic Data Center. They've been emailing me files because I was able to find temperature data from June 1853 when Detroit got to 106 degrees. DC was 102 degrees that day. And then up in Fort Brady, which is on the northern peninsula of Michigan, got to 106 degrees as well. That's what you call unprecedented heat. But these people telling me, well, the heat waves are increasing. I said, well, why are you looking at that data? And I pulled up the data from the climate science special report from the National Climate Assessment, the Fourth National Climate Assessment, NCA4, Chapter 6, where the scientists, they go in this report, they look at the extreme heat. They look at the heat wave frequency, which is the top left, and they look at the heat wave magnitude, which is the previous chart we showed, and it's also in the bottom right panel, but it's cherry picked. The only difference between what the EPA shows in this 4-panel chart and the NCA report is that this is grouped by decade, and it's versus by year, which is what's in the report. But the report goes back to 1901, and you see a much different picture if you look at the full data set. And what's interesting is climate alarmists always like to say that climate skeptics are cherry picking data. And I got accused of this a couple of weeks ago when we had the heat wave in the northeastern United States. Everybody's going boo about it being 90 degrees in New York State and in Vermont, up in the upper 90s in Maine. And I don't understand because they'll make the claim. This heat's unprecedented. Heat extremes are becoming more common. So then you show them these charts, like the ones that we've been presenting, that show that that's not the case, or that you say, hey, it was hotter in 1925, or hotter in 1933, or 1954, 1988. That was a really bad heat wave. 2012, as recently as 2012, we had a worse heat wave than what we saw a couple weeks ago. But they claim, well, you're just cherry picking, or that's just weather. And my favorite one is the United States is less than 2% of global land area or global surface area. Okay, but
we heard that argument a lot.
Aren't you the fool that is blaming the heat wave in New York, which is less than 2% of global surface area on climate? And you point this out to people, and this really grinds it really frustrates me. You can see it when I post it because, and I get a little out of hand sometimes. I have to rein it in, but it frustrates me with these people because you can talk till you're blue in the face and they will not understand that that they don't see the hypocrisy in their argument. I think some of them know that they are, but they don't care. It's just frustrating.
I'm a bit concerned, Chris. The data you just talked about earlier from Detroit and Washington, D.C. from the 1850s, I'm afraid now I'm going to see research published saying climate change caused the Civil War.
That's funny. What's actually interesting about that, though, I like to bring up the Civil War, is that in D.C., I believe I have a book called Civil War Weather in Virginia. There was a reverend who kept temperature data for D.C. through the 1860s, from 1860 to 1865 during the Civil War. And
the Army Signal Corps, I believe, was measuring temperatures during that period, right?
Yes, correct. And there was another guy that was taking measurements, and there were actually no big snowstorms during the Civil War. There actually was one, but it happened in April and it dropped a foot of snow. And I think it was 1863. Don't quote me on that. The book's upstairs in my room, but I'd have to find it. But I think it was April 1863. There was a foot of snow in April. Other than that, though, there was no big storms. I mean, there was no other storms that dropped more than a foot of snow, which is kind of unusual. And considering that everybody used to say, well, DC always got the snow back in the day. And the winters, there were a couple of winters that it was in the 70s that rivaled 2015 and 1889. And there was one summer that it got to 104 degrees 3 days in a row or something like that. I had to find the data. I had to look at the book, but don't quote me on those exact numbers, but that's roughly correct from what I remember. So we've had extreme heat. It's been around us for our entire time that we've been recording measurements. But you look at the overnight low temperatures, that's what they always deflect to. Well, a lot of that's due to, as Anthony mentioned earlier, the urban heat island effect. Not only do you have buildings that absorb heat during the day and they they emit it out at night. And you can actually feel this on our weather center at my university. I was standing outside talking to a couple of people one evening after the sun had kind of gone below the horizon, and I could feel the heat coming off the brick building. I mean, it was that intense. And if you put a thermometer there, it's going to register that. I mean, Anthony has done incredible work on this and uncovering a lot. I mean, the biases in the surface temperature record. I mean, it's incredible. 96% of stations are not adequate, which is actually startling, because that's what we're supposed to be pulling our climate data from. And you also have the facts that in the rural areas, a lot of times the atmosphere is supposed to decouple at night. You get this, the surface cools off really rapidly and the air above it cools, but you get a little bit warmer air aloft. It sets up a temperature inversion. This is very frequent, especially in the fall and winter months. And then during the daytime, you get the convection and you start getting the mixing, and it starts to make a more uniform temperature profile. And eventually it actually decreases with height. But if you have buildings up at night, and these conditions, by the way, have to occur with clear skies and light winds for optimal radiational cooling at the surface. But if you start putting buildings up, like big high rises and skyscrapers, that also, not only do you have the emission of the retention of heat at night from the urban heat island effect, but you also have these buildings that disrupts the wind flow, and it starts creating this turbulent adiabatic mixing, and it mixes warm air down. And it creates, and it doesn't allow that inversion to set up. It doesn't allow the surface to cool off as much. Dr. John Christie was talking about this in a presentation he gave a couple of years ago. And in some areas, in the rural settings, we have overnight temperatures going up, and that's because of the fact that there's increased corn sweat. We have record high crop yields, and there's increased evapotranspiration, which, if it raises the dew points, it prevents the temperature from falling as much overnight. Anybody who's ever played manhunt in a cornfield at night knows how hot and humid cornfields are. And we have a lot of temperature data from those areas. Yes, while carbon dioxide and greenhouse forcing on the climate system should have some effect, it is by and large overwhelmed by the urban heat island effect and increased corn sweat.
Yeah.
So, Chris, you said something. It's not just you. We hear this all the time: extreme heat or extreme cold. Now, I have the advantage that our audience didn't. I got to see your questions in advance, but it leads me to your opening questions. I think extreme biases our thinking just off the top every time you put extreme in front of something, because extreme is has to be compared to a norm, and I would say a localized norm. There is no global temperature. There are temperatures at locations. And what is extreme in Texas, or what is extreme in, say, DC or Minnesota, wouldn't be extreme in Texas during summer temperatures in Texas. You expect them to be certain things. If they were like that in Minnesota, that's extreme. Well, okay, extreme is relative to something.
Yep. And
concerns about temperature are relative to something. As if we know, we have a God's eye point of view. This is the temperature that should be or would be. This is the optimum temperature. But we don't have that God's eye point of view.
Yes. And I think that's an important point, because local climate, local weather is far more important than nobody feels global average temperature. And yeah, you can compute a global average temperature, but you can also compute the average phone number in a phone book. It doesn't really mean anything. I guess it's kind of important for radiation fluxes and stuff and energy balance stuff, because that's a point Roy Spencer makes, and I'd be inclined to agree with him on that. But as far as it's become there's the concept of a climate emergency does not exist in any relevant data metric that they'll say, well, the Arctic sea ice is declining. Okay, well, that doesn't tell me why it's bad. And it doesn't explain why it was ice free in the summertime 10,000 to 6,000 years ago during the early Holocene climate optimum. But the point is that there's no relevant data metric. The climate crisis is a political distinction that's made to center around how climate change is supposedly affecting the overall human condition, human well-being, whether it's like life expectancy, because they say climate change is killing people, or so the number of disaster deaths, or the share of the population that's malnourished, or the number of the crop yields. They always talk about how climate change is causing devastation on crops, but yet crop yields are at record highs. The share of the population that's undernourished is at a record low. The share of the number of disaster-related deaths has decreased by more than 90% since 1920. So there's no indication that the human condition is worsening. And so they create this construct of a global average temperature, and they think that, well, that determines the temperature departure from 1850 somehow as the control knob of extreme weather, and not only that, but our vulnerability to it, and how bad it's going to affect human civilization. There's absolutely no indication that the global temperature really has that much effect on any of that. I mean, historically, warm periods have been more optimal for life, but the global temperature, it exists in obscure metrics like that because they can't find, and they gaslight people and they manipulate them into thinking that global temperature is the control knob of all of these things. But they do that, and they're successful at it because people don't fact check. They're gullible. But the reality is that no data actually indicates that the human condition is getting worse, where the human welfare is better than it ever has been in history. And it brings me back to my other point. It's back to your point that global temperature, sure, but it doesn't. People don't feel global temperature. People don't feel global temperature. They feel what's local to them. So local climates are far more important to everyday people. The global picture and everything is not really, in my opinion, that relevant.
All right. So we've got those questions. I think Sterling wants to lead into these questions that you prepared, and these were pretty powerful. I looked at this and I thought, wow, these are really good. Go ahead, Sterling.
Well, that was my lead in. I mean, the lead in, I don't see the first question up, but I think I recalled from it, it being, what is the natural temperature of the earth or something like that. Andy, could you put up the question?
They're on they're scrolling
It
along
is
the
up.
bottom.
It's scrolling on the bottom.
Oh, I see. To the nearest 10th of a degree Celsius, what is the correct global? Yeah, mean surface temperature. That's what I'm saying is I never understood people thinking that we know what the temperature should or ought to be. So there's your first question. What's the 10th degree? What's the global mean average temperature should be?
Right.
Yeah,
And question number two.
Yeah, question number 2 follows up on that.
Yeah, I always ask people that question. It's like, what's the correct? And a lot of people ask this question. It's not something that I came up with. Some of these questions I came up with. Some of them are just ones that people always ask. But the first one is one of the ones that a lot of climate, people on Team Reality ask, and they say, what is alarmists can never answer. What's the correct global temperature? Well, they say, well, a temperature that's stable, but that doesn't tell you what the temperature is. What's the temperature to the nearest 10th degree Celsius? And they never want to answer that. Usually they'll like to indicate that the climate, because they always talk about departure from 1850 climate conditions. They think that the pre-industrial climate of 1850 is more ideal. And so then you ask them, well, why is the climate of 1850 more ideal than this climate? I think that's the second question. I don't remember off the top of my head. But why would the climate during the end of the Little Ice Age be better for life on Earth than the warmer climate we have today? And they never answer that question either. And I don't think there's a correct global average temperature. I mean, there's probably a range that's optimal for life, but there's no indication that 1.5 degrees Celsius cooling would be better for humanity than 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming relative to that baseline.
Yeah, there's no reason to think that the 1850s were the magic, the golden mean for human creativity and survival and things like that.
And I always ask them. I always say, listen, they'll say, well, that 1850 climate is ideal. Okay, then you ask them why, and one of their answers will be there's 3 things that they'll reply with. One is either they don't know and they just block you, which that happens most often. I can't tell you. I'm probably blocked by as many people that follow me as there's probably as many people that have me blocked as follow me. And then the second thing that they'll reply with is they'll say, well, 1850 was when humans were influencing the climate, so we shouldn't meddle with the climate. We should be wherever the climate is supposed to be naturally is where we're supposed to be at. It doesn't matter how it affects humans. Okay, well, whatever. And then the third thing that they'll say is that, what was the third thing that they'll say? I lost my train of thought. My train of thought derailed. Kind of trying to think.
Well, I mean, the answer, one response to what you just said is, no, humans have been affecting the environment for as long as humans have been around. Ask the mammoths or all the large megafauna that disappeared. Ask regional climates where the breadbasket of humanity arose, Sumerians, Babylonians, over there in the Tigris Euphrates valleys, where agriculture became mass. That affected the environment. That radically changed what was going on there. And to pretend that we weren't affecting it before the 1850s is idiotic. I mean, in England, the Industrial Revolution started even earlier than the 1850s.
Yep. Very good points. And
I want to address a comment that came up here. One of our commenters put up a comment about addressing Gerald Cutney. Yeah, this guy, he's like the mega troll on climate on Twitter, and he accused me of sea lioning, and I'd never heard this term before.
Yeah, I don't know what sea lioning
what does that mean?
So I looked it up, and here it is. Sea lioning is a type of trolling or harassment that consists of pursuing people with relentless requests for evidence, often tangential or previously addressed, while maintaining a pretense of civility and sincerity and feigning ignorance of the subject matter.
How dare you?
I guess they call it sea lining based on sea lions chasing salmon or something, because they're pretty relentless. But I have a feeling that sea lions know exactly what they're doing when they're chasing salmon. They're not feigning ignorance at all.
Yeah. All right, let's go on to question number 2 if we haven't already addressed that. I was looking at some other things. I wasn't.
Yeah, no, we did. Number 2 has been addressed. Why don't we go to number 3?
Okay. So what's the correct amount of severe weather? Huh? How many tropical cyclones, tornadoes, thunderstorms, hailstorms, droughts, floods, heat waves, cold waves, and fires should there be per year globally? Please provide exact numbers and then explain why.
This one's fun because they and I always love this. This is one thing that I really amuses me, and I've had to. It's been unending, the comments I get from these people, that especially with Hurricane Beryl, the California heat wave, the heat wave we had here in the eastern U.S. a couple of weeks ago. They always go boo anytime the weather does something unusual, or it's actually usual. There was nothing really unusual about that heat wave on the grand scheme of things. But anytime the weather does something out of the ordinary, it's automatically climate change. They automatically say that extreme weather is getting worse. It's the worst it's ever been. And they say extremes aren't increasing. And then you show them that it's not increasing. These extremes are not getting more frequent. And in fact, in some cases, the extremes are going down. Then you prove it, you show them that data, then they try and gaslight you by claiming that you're not talking about averages. Averages are what matter, but they were just talking about extremes. As a scientist in training, my job, the job of a scientist in general, is to test claims or hypotheses against observational data, because in science you have to measure things. A computer model, you can get to say whatever you want. A model's not evidence of anything, but what is evidence is actual data, measurements, and you record those observations every time, you see what's going on. And so when somebody makes a claim about extreme weather, well, as a scientist, your job is to test that claim against data. And so I directly look at claims and I refute them. And then climate activists get upset when they are shown that they're wrong, so they start changing the topic to averages. But they can never tell me, oh, we have too many heat waves. They say, well, I have all these heat waves, or we have all these hurricanes or 1 year, or we have all these wildfires. But what's the right amount supposed to be? Is it supposed to be the average? Because if you take the average high temperature on July 5th in Washington, D.C. is 90 degrees. That's the average, the 30-year average. You take all the July 5th since you look at the 1990 to 2020, 1991 to 2020 mean, and you look at those July 5th maximum temperatures from 1991 to 2020, you average those 30 years together, or you sum them up and then you divide them by 30, that's going to be your average. It's be 90 degrees. But on any given day, it's not going to be 90 degrees. It might be occasionally, but it's not going to be, it might be 95, it might be 102, it might be 77 or 84 degrees, and it averages out to 90 over that 30-year period. So it's very rarely ever going to be average. So when they claim it's supposed to be normal, or it's supposed to be, there's supposed to be a certain amount. Well, it's not ever normal. It's always going to be one extreme or another. Extremes make averages. Averages are mathematical constructs. Nature kind of tries to seek an equilibrium, but it's always going to be on the extreme one way or the other. So when they say that we have all these heat waves, we are seeing an increasing number of these events, which we're really not. But they say that. Well, what's the correct number supposed to be? What are we supposed to have? And they never want to answer that question.
I'm going to disagree with you, Chris. I don't think nature seeks anything. That's anthropomorphizing. I'm sorry. Nature doesn't seek balance. There's no such thing as balance in nature. There are events. And if it gets too hot for a while, nature doesn't try and say, oh, well, now I'm going to balance it out and give us some cool. No, it's just weather is what weather is. It works on the physics, but the physics has there's no conscious thing trying to drive it to some kind of balance or anything. That's just, we always say that. We say, oh, well, ecosystems are in balance. No, they're not in balance. They change all the time. And then they reach what's called a climax state, and then they burn down and they start over again. But it wasn't because Mother Nature said, well, we got to reset this thing.
Yeah.
That's
Before
fair.
we go on to our
That's
next
fair.
question, I want to show you this comic that came up about sea lioning because it's hilarious. Andy's got it up there. Bring the sea lion comic up because I didn't understand the whole sea lioning thing, but this is exactly what they're talking about. Andy, can you bring that up, please? Anyway, I guess not. All right. Well, never mind. We'll move on. So let's go on to question number 4. Why do you think temperature departures from the 1850 climatic baseline mean is the sole metric which determines human welfare? Why would the climate of the Little Ice Age be preferable compared to today's climate? What was better about the climate in 1850 than that of 2024? Is today's climate too dangerous? If so, why? Provide data and evidence to support your reasoning.
Yeah, we kind of touched this one already, but when you point out to them, they ask them why is the climate of 1850 better? They never really give you a good reason other than they say, well, it was when humans weren't changing the climate, which, as Sterling pointed out, it's not actually true. I mean, humans have always impacted the environment in some capacity since we've been around, but there's no indication that the climate in 1850 was any less extreme than it is today. We certainly had heat waves back then. And actually, back in 1860, we had a heat wave in the, looking at some of the fort data, we had a heat wave in the Great Plains of the United States. This actually occurred during the Civil War drought. There was a Civil War drought from about it was called the Civil War drought. It was about 1855 to about 1864. So it was like a 9-year drought. And it was very similar in terms of the spatial extent and magnitude of the Dust Bowl. And it was not caused by farming practices as they claimed the Dust Bowl was. And temperatures in Kansas got to 115 degrees. And I think it was it was Manhattan, Kansas. They had got to 115 degrees, I think it was like July 11th, 1860. It was somewhere in that 1 week period. And that was, if it was included in their official period record, which I think began in the 1880s, that would be the highest temperature ever recorded there, second to July 1936 when they got to 116 degrees. So we've had these extreme events. This idea that the climate was perfect before humans came along or before industrialization came along is simply just nonsense. We had look at the snowstorms that impacted the New England in the 1700s, the Great Blizzard of 1717. Back in the 1780s, I think it was the winter of 1780, the Mississippi River froze all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. That doesn't happen at all anymore. In February 1895, Houston, Texas got 20 inches of snow. It snowed in parts of Mexico. We don't get that anymore. So the climate's been more extreme in the past. This idea it's more extreme now, or that the climate back then was better, and this climate today is not ideal, is just simply nonsense. They don't know what they're talking about.
All righty. Yeah, good points. Good points. Now here's one. Question 5. What is the correct atmospheric carbon dioxide level? Well, I can tell you it's anything over 250 parts per million, because at that level you can't get any plants basically shut down. Photosynthesis stops. And we
100
got very close to that, I believe, back during the last ice age. So
150 parts per million, Anthony.
150,
yeah.
sorry, not
Yeah.
250.
Yeah, we got down to 180 parts per million in the ice age.
Yeah,
Right.
and there's
So we need carbon dioxide to make plants grow.
Sterling's right. Yeah, about that one we got down to 180 at the end of the last glacial maximum about 20,000 years ago. And when you get down to 150 parts per million, as Anthony stated, photosynthetic processes in plants become so inefficient that most plant life begins to start dying off. And eventually, because there's a chain reaction, everything else kind of starts to follow afterward. I'm sure there's some exceptions, but there's by and large, there is actual evidence, because climate alarmists always appeal to peer-reviewed literature. And I have found several studies that have indicated, based on different plant types, that there was a widespread plant starvation at the end of the last glacial maximum, because carbon dioxide levels got down to 180 parts per million. Had they dropped another 30 parts per million, we probably wouldn't be here talking today, because that would have set off a chain reaction. So we're now up to about 424 parts per million or so right now. And historically, we're even in the geological time frame of things, we're historically low. It's been upwards of 7,000 parts per million, like 540 million years ago. And that's when the greatest expansion of life occurred on Earth. So ideally, plants thrive. I've read some studies somewhere around 800 parts per million, 800 to 1,200 parts per million is ideal for plant growth. So we're far off from that. We still have more than, to double what we have now to get there. And that's going to take a long time.
So question 6, the Inflation Reduction Act was popularized as the biggest piece of climate legislation in history. But since it was signed into law, climate activists say climate change has only gotten worse. Well, why is that? If we're throwing all this money at the problem, why isn't it getting better?
We've spent, I don't know, trillions of dollars. I don't know what the exact number is on fighting climate change for the last 30, 40 years, probably more than that. And climate, I saw a tweet the other day, or Joe Biden or somebody stated, I think it was him at the debate the other night, he stated that he signed the biggest piece of climate legislation into law. But climate activists, based on what we see now, with everybody is freaking out about Hurricane Beryl and the heat wave in California, apparently climate change has only gotten worse since it was signed into law. The climate's only gotten worse under Joe Biden's watch. But Michael Mann, I think, stated the other day that it's game over for the climate if Trump wins. But apparently it's game over now that Biden's in office. People, I always tell individuals, I told them the other day, I said, it doesn't matter who wins the 2024 election. And I told them in 2020, it didn't matter who won that election, that it's going to have no discernible impact on the climate. But your energy bills are going to change a little bit. And some of your freedoms, if the green people on the green agenda get their way, they're gonna you're gonna get less reliable energy, but it's going to be more expensive. You're going to get a less efficient car, but it's going to be more expensive. So you're not net zero. This aim to achieve net zero emissions does nothing but reduce the quality of life.
Well, we actually know the answer to that question. Why, despite all the spending, have we not said? And it's our fault. It's the Heartland Institute's fault, because we have.
How dare you?
We have kept climate skepticism going. It's Trump's fault for running. If he weren't running, the climate would be magically great. We have the answer to that. I feel dutifully chastised and guilty.
Do you want me to send you a thoughts and prayers card?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah. One thing that's funny, one thing I want to touch on that is that you're right. That's their answer to it. That they'll blame me, and they'll blame Linnea, Anthony Watts, evil Anthony Watts here, and they'll blame the Heartland Institute and CFACT and all these other people. But if your argument, you see, it's not our fault. It's just that their arguments aren't compelling. That's the problem, is that if the public is not buying what you're saying, then your arguments just suck. That's all it boils down to. Your science is not convincing enough.
I've got a question for you, Chris. How does it feel to actually make supposed professionals with all of their accolades in their bios and stuff go absolutely apoplectic with just like one tweet?
I don't know. I think people. I had the same effect on people. I think Trump and Ron DeSantis have. I live rent free in their head. I should start charging them like $500 a month rent because I mean I make bank. The thing is, a lot of meteorologists, the people in my field, agree with what I say. I mean, your local TV meteorologist, I know a lot of them. Some really big names and really big TV markets that follow me. It's privately met. We have a private, little bit of a group chat, but we all love it. I mean, I'm going up to see a couple tomorrow to have lunch to discuss some things. But a lot of them agree with me. And there's some people that are like PhDs that love what I do. There's a lot of people that follow me on Twitter are meteorologists that at NASA and NOAA. They have anonymous accounts and they verify their identities to me. They have like the most obscure looking account and they're actual legit scientists. Some people in pretty high positions. That's all I'm really allowed to say on that. But I have a lot of people that support what I do. But what's interesting is that a lot of the big climate experts out there, like Dr. Robert Rohde or Zeke Hosfather. Now, I like the two of them. They both have always been cordial to me and respectful and have engaged in good faith debate. And I think that I respect them because they're on the other side and they present decent arguments. And they've always been cordial to me, especially Robert. He's always been phenomenal with me. Paul Williams, I know he's gone after. I know he and Curry have gone at it, but Paul has always been nice to me. He actually follows me. So I don't have problems with them. And they don't really come on my page and argue with me. And there's one climate scientist who does follow me. He debates with me about some of my stuff, but he never questions my claims on extreme weather because he privately admitted to me that he agrees with me on the extreme weather stuff that I talk about. But when it comes to some of the other stuff, he's like, okay, you're wrong. But a lot of these experts don't come onto my page. But there's other people in other fields that are not meteorology related, not geology or physics related. They're like biologists or whatever, or chemists who think that they know more than me about the weather and they want to argue with me and I make their heads explode and they think that their PhD makes them smarter than everybody. But it's fun. I enjoy just watching their heads explode. You know, my professors at my university are all PhDs. They're all very smart. They don't flex their credentials. They don't like show their biceps and say, I'm smarter than you. They talk with you. They debate with you. They are the good kinds of PhDs. But there's a lot of people out there who think that their education equates to intelligence, and that's simply not the case. You can still have a PhD and be dumber than a box of rocks.
All righty. So we're getting a little pressed for time here. So I'm going to combine questions 7 and 8. So question 7 says, trillions of taxpayer dollars have been spent on the so-called climate action over the past 35 years. When will that give us the perfect climate? And when it does, how will we know? What will be the measure of having a perfect climate? And then question 8 is kind of related. If the U.S. spends hundreds of trillions of dollars to decarbonize our economy to achieve net zero by the year 2050, then how much will it reduce global mean surface temperature by the year 2100, assuming the climate models are accurate? Please round your answer to the nearest tenth of a degree and show your math. They can't do that either.
Nope. And I think those kind of questions are kind of self-explanatory. I'm curious if Sterling has anything to comment on those.
Well, you know, in testimony, what they say is, oh, that's not how we measure success. Okay, then tell me how you measure. Well, we measure success by the number of other countries that sort of follow our lead, or by the dollars spent. It's like, no, this is about climate change. Tell me, how many hurricanes will you be preventing? How much sea level rise will we avoid? That is, if climate is the standard, that is the measures of success, not whether people agree with you. Not whether, the consensus has gone up from 97 to 99%. That's not success on climate. The climate doesn't care how many people agree with you.
Correct.
And so it's always offensive when they say, you ask them point blank, how much temperature rise will it prevent? How much sea level rise will it prevent? How many hurricanes will it prevent? What will be the averages after all this is done? And they say, oh, that's not how we measure success.
Yeah.
Very good.
Let's go on to question 9. Question 9 says, if you can't provide me with an answer to question 8 about, what is the nearest tenth of a degree by 2100 going to be if you do all of this net zero stuff? So then here's my follow-up. If you don't know how much net zero emissions in the U.S. would reduce the global mean surface temperature by 2100, Are we supposed to just spend all that money and see what happens? Well, apparently that's what we're doing now, isn't it?
Yeah, I actually had a good that question. Actually, I was inspired by a hearing that Senator John Kennedy was at. There was this a skier who was about my age who went to testify, and Kennedy asked him. He said, "What is CO2?" And it was a hilarious exchange. And the kid, I mean, grant you, Gus Schumacher, I think was his name. He's not a climate expert. He was just there to testify because he was pressured into it. Asked to, I think, on behalf of the Senate Democrats. I think Senator Whitehouse, I believe, and to testify about the lack of snow in Alaska or something, and how that's affecting his skiing. But if you're going to come in as an expert witness, you should be prepared to answer some pretty basic scientific questions. And he just said, "Well, it's a gas." And then Kennedy asked him, he said, "Well, what's the, how much of it is in the atmosphere? Is it a small part of the atmosphere, or is it a large part of the atmosphere?" And the kid said, "Oh, it's a large part of our atmosphere." And Kennedy said, "No, it's a very small part of our atmosphere." And then he asked him, so if we go to net zero emissions by 2050, how much will that reduce global average temperatures by 2100? And if you don't know that, then are we just supposed to, he said he didn't know. And he said, "Well, if you don't know, then are we just supposed to spend our money, to spend taxpayer dollars on this and just see what happens?" And that's one of my favorite questions to ask people. And they claim, well, it's a better investment. They say, well, we should be looking out for the climate. We should do something anyway. But that's not a wise use of money if there's not going to be the catastrophe happening. And in fact, we've been promised of a catastrophe happening for the last 30 years, and we're still waiting. I'm still waiting for the United Nations 1989 prediction that sea level rise is going to wipe us out by 2000 if we don't stop global warming. So it's been almost a quarter of a century since that's supposed to come to pass. The Arctic ice was supposed to be ice free in 2008, according to a guy who works at the National Snow and Ice Data Center, and that didn't happen. So these predictions, one after another, keep failing, and I don't know what it's going to take for these people to understand or to question what they're being told.
Yeah. All right, so let's go on to our final question, number 10. Why do efforts to mitigate climate change exclusively center on reducing carbon emissions and ignore the more effective strategies such as building weather-resilient infrastructure and enforcing stricter zoning and building codes? Seems sensible to me, and I would think that money that we're throwing at net zero could be far better used in these areas. But they don't.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Regardless of what the direction of change of various climatic variables are going, we are, while we are not as humans, as far as like death risk goes from disasters, we've been able to mitigate that. I mean, the natural disaster deaths related to meteorological events have decreased by over 90% since 1920. But while we're able to save lives because of our warning coordination and weather forecasting abilities, due to the technological advancements we've made in the last 50, 60 years, we are, as a society, increasingly vulnerable to extreme weather events, particularly hurricanes, hailstorms in the case of our renewable energy infrastructure, and we are increasingly vulnerable to tornado damage and wildfires, especially if you're out west in California or in Australia, where they got the bushfires. That is true regardless of whether the climate is changing or not, because we simply have more stuff to destroy. There's more infrastructure. We've built a vast amount of wealth that's placed in the destructive path of Mother Nature. And as Linnea mentioned earlier, talking about the renewable energy projects like wind and solar, while everything is vulnerable, we have these things spread out over a larger area. So we have a tornado come through or a hurricane, it's more likely to be targeted, to be destroyed. And it's going to cost people billions of dollars. And insurance companies don't want to insure that. They blame climate change for this, but they to help as a justification to raise premiums and also to remain profitable, because any business wants to remain profitable. But if we're going to be, regardless of what climate's doing, trying to reduce the impacts of this, we should be focusing on, okay, we're not going to develop houses along the coastline or in the floodplains. Or if we do, we'll put them on the stilts or have better infrastructure that can withstand storm surge or hurricane winds, and have better, in the case of wildfires, maybe putting power lines underground. That's going to have a whole lot, and better forest management. that's going to have a lot more significant impact on the effects that has on our society than spending hundreds of trillions of dollars into decarbonizing our economy and sabotaging, not only our energy independence, but also national security.
Yeah, genetic engineering of mosquitoes to wipe out the mosquitoes that carry diseases will have far greater impact on reducing malaria and dengue fever and things than spending hundreds of trillions of dollars reducing CO2. Malaria was endemic to the United States and most of Europe until recently, when we came up with responses. Resilience and adaptation have always been and remain the best response to climate change, whatever the cause and whatever the direction it takes.
Absolutely agree.
All right. Linnea, time for question and answer. Take it away.
Great. Okay. And I will add a little bit to what we were just talking about, that I think probably the reason why they don't focus on things that would actually work is because the goal isn't really to stop emissions. The goal is to institute worldwide communism or something like it. So I would say until that goal is achieved, they're not going to stop. Let's see. First question that we have here is, how does a young scientist like Chris survive if not claiming we're all going to die?
Get a t-shirt.
This is a good question. So I'm having somebody plug in my laptop cord because my laptop's going to die if I don't plug it in. So sorry for any background noise. People always ask me this question all the time. How do I survive? Or how am I so fearless? And the reason is because despite all the hate that I get and all the threats and stuff people send into me or whatever, I'm not deterred. I'm not fazed by it. I'm not intimidated by online anonymous trolls. And thankfully, the people at my university my professors, while they may not agree with what I say, they defend my right to freedom of speech. They understand that I back my claims up with facts, and they will defend me in that, which is nice, because not every university would probably be, not every professor would be like that. So I'm very grateful and thankful, and more appreciative than I should probably be even more appreciative than I already am of that. But I'm able to get away with it a little bit more than other people, probably because not only of that, but also because, again, I pay the university to go to school. They don't pay me. If I was on their salary, this would be a whole different story. And and it also helps keeping me going because I have a lot of followers on Twitter and Facebook now, and they support me. So people that are critics, I have a lot of support from within the industry, privately, some publicly, that don't have jobs to risk, or like are in the private sector and they can do whatever they want. And I have people that my social media followers just really inspire me to keep me going because they love what I do. And it's like the music industry. One of my favorite country music singers, because I'm a country music fan. I don't know about anybody else, but I know some people hate country, and that's fine. But Travis Tritt was talking about Waylon Jennings and how the critics in the industry hated him, and they said, "You're never going to make it." He ended up being one of the biggest people in the genre and having some of the biggest awards, some of the biggest hits. He's in the Country Music Hall of Fame. And he said he wanted to do things one way and one way only. And that's his way. And that's the way I do things, is my way. And I probably won't have a traditional meteorology job out of college. That's not the direction I necessarily want to go. I want to do things with people that like what I do. And there's been plenty of job offers out there. So I'm not really worried about that. Have I probably burned some bridges doing what I do? Absolutely. But it's also opened up a lot of doors and connections to some really awesome people that I never would have gotten, that none of my peers have the opportunity to. So it's worth it to do what I do. And in closing a few doors in the industry is a small price to pay for keeping my soul and integrity intact.
Very well said. Thank you. And also, before we go on with the questions here, I wanted to point out something really great that happened this week. And that is we received $20 in the mail in the physical snail mail from our friend Andrew Godrich. So thank you very much, Andrew. If you're still watching, sorry we didn't get to you at the beginning of the show, but I just wanted to say thank you very much. And for context, for people who have not been watching the show the last couple weeks, YouTube demonetized us, so we can no longer get Snapchats, or not Snapchats, what am I saying? Super chats. Getting all my social medias mixed up here. We can no longer get super chats. And so one of our great supporters, Andrew, physically mailed us a $20 bill instead. And and a nice letter and everything. So that was really great. We really appreciate it. Very funny. Thank you. All right, next we have this question from Leah, who says, is the polar vortex caused partly by the geographical or magnetic North Pole doing walkabout polar shift? I don't think so.
I don't think so either. A lot of people always ask me about this magnetic field stuff, and that's not my area of expertise. And as far as I know, there's not really been much research on any of that stuff. I'm not really one to really speak for that. Some of that might be something more for an astrophysicist to say. My area is just specifically meteor. I mean, it's a great question. It's an honest question. A lot of people ask about it. I'm not going to say that they're wrong, but I don't really, from my knowledge and what I learned, what I'm taught, and what I've read, I don't really think it has that much of an effect, at least on the time scales that we're concerned with.
To sum it up simply, air is not magnetic. So I don't think there's much effect.
Not too much. What are your estimates on the level of influence of contrail-induced clouds, so like cirrus clouds, on the temperature of the Earth? Because they block heat coming from the sun during the day and block it escaping at night, just like normal clouds.
There's been some research on this, but I haven't read it too much in details. I don't have a definitive answer on what the amount is. One thing I can say though is that that clouds have a very profound impact on the climate system. That's through feedbacks and stuff. And kind of unrelated, but the decrease in the sulfur dioxide concentrations we've had, I think, is a large reason why the Atlantic Ocean, the oceans are so warm right now. Is that we've been warming since the end of the ice age, but we've increased the amount of there's a lot of sulfur content in shipping fuel. When it burns, when it's coming through the combustion process, that sulfur reacts with oxygen and forms sulfur dioxide that's emitted into the atmosphere. Sulfur dioxide is a very powerful aerosol, much more powerful than the influences of greenhouse gases like CO2, and it reflects solar radiation out. So we had all these emissions of sulfur, and it probably reduced the rate at which the ocean has warmed over the last several decades. And then in 2020, there was a new standard that was adopted by the International Maritime Organization, and that reduced that dropped sulfur content in shipping fuel by like 80%. And this is especially true over the shipping lanes in the tropics, because that's also where most of our solar radiation comes in. So we reduced that, and all of a sudden the temperatures in the ocean start just rising dramatically. And they blame this on CO2. This is climate change. But the thing is that the incident infrared radiation is not powerful enough to warm much more than the top few millimeters, top few micrometers of ocean surface. So this warming has had to be due to increased absorbed solar radiation. And oceans have 1,000 times the heat capacity of the atmosphere. And then these sulfur dioxide aerosols also act as cloud condensation nuclei to form highly reflective clouds. And contrails do include clouds, or types of clouds. So there's been a reduction in cloud cover, and that's a lot more solar radiation. And so clouds have a very profound impact on the climate. And contrails, I don't know how much they affect it specifically, but there's been some research on it. I'll have to look into that a little bit more.
Yeah, I think our friend Chris here has a good point, which is that, the volume of the atmosphere is so large. How much really do even all the flights in the world really change, or are able to influence that? Even if they were all running contrails the entire time in flight, which they don't. Contrails go on and off. Okay.
Yeah, it depends on saturation and all that. Yeah.
Wasn't North America once subtropical, and in another epoch, a third covered in glaciers?
I would say yes to that, based on the fossil record that we've seen throughout the United States.
Yeah, so I think the point there was mostly just climate changes, and quite a bit. Okay, let's
Climate
see.
is not static.
Right.
Just like weather. The weather is not the
We live
same
on a
from
planet.
day to day.
We
dynamic
live on a
planet.
planet where the only thing constant is the state of change. So if the thing is, if the planet was not changing, then I'd be a little bit more concerned.
Heraclitus, Heraclitus rules.
Okay, Chris asks, what is the difference between proxy data and poxy data? Answer, one is disease-ridden, check with man. That was a little bit of a joke for us. Thank you, Chris. All right.
Poxy data is what you get during pandemics.
Wheelman asks if we can get Willie Soon on. I would like to have Willie Soon on. He's a cool guy. I like him. He's a friend of Harlan.
He's a big fan of mine too. I've been, and Craig was telling me, because I guess everybody, he was over in the Vienna conference, and I was like, "Dang!" Mark's like, "Craig, you should have had Chris come," but I know there was like budget issues and stuff. But Willie Sin is somebody I've been really wanting to meet. I really want to sit down and talk to him about some of the solar stuff, because that's not my area of expertise. Again, I'm meteorology. I'm not solar. That's beyond my pay grade. And so yeah, that'd be cool to have him on here.
Well, we'll get you to our next climate conference, and you'll get to meet him.
Okay, I've got one
I'm
more.
actually getting to meet William Happer in August.
Yeah.
So he's going to give me a tour of Princeton.
We have one more question, and this one I think we kind of just answered a little bit ago. This person asks, Allie's dad asks, how much does stratospheric aerosol injection play into the heat dome effect?
Well, I think that it would, if you had a stratospheric aerosol injection, it would actually reduce the intensity of heat because it has a net cooling effect on the planet. So I think we've kind of answered that one already. But yeah, it's a good question.
All right, that's what we got.
Volcanic activity is one of the biggest injectors of stratospheric aerosol out there.
Well, and then
there you go. SO2.
Hunga Tonga was one of the largest injections of water vapor into the atmosphere in centuries. One fell swoop, 10% addition of water vapor to the upper stratosphere. And gosh, you think that might have had a warming effect?
Yeah, I think it probably has. But it's interesting because there's been a lot of papers that have come out about this, and each paper seems to have a different conclusion on how much it's affected the climate. I mean, some papers, because even though I don't necessarily agree with him, Andrew Dessler was talking about some papers that came out. I said it doesn't have that much of an effect. I read them. They made a compelling case, but then Judith Curry and other people are talking about how it's had a big effect, and they've cited some other papers. So it depends on the study. So I want to see more research come out before I really come to my own conclusion on how much it affected it. But I think it definitely did. And if it did, it was probably a warming effect just because of the sheer amount of water that was injected into the atmosphere.
I think we're about to close. Before we do, Chris, why don't you tell us a little about, how people can get a hold of you and, your different sites and things.
So my Snapchat, I'm just kidding. My Twitter is at Chris Martz WX, which I think is displayed on the screen there. You can find me at the same username on Facebook, but you might just search for Chris Martz Weather. You'll find me there. Those are the only two social media platforms I use for this kind of stuff. And you can also find my blog at chrismartzweather.com. I post there occasionally. I do a really in-depth analyses on extreme weather events. So when the media comes in saying, "Oh, this is the worst hurricane ever," I look at that specific extreme weather event. I explain the meteorology behind it, what's going on, the impacts, and why climate change is probably not the reason for or not impacting it as they claim. So that's what I do on my blog, but it takes a lot of time to write those articles and because they're very long, and I'm one person, so I don't do them that often. But go check them out for some good reading if you're interested.
All right, very good. Chris, thank you for being on with us today. Thank you for what you're doing on Twitter. You've come up with some fantastic and in many cases irrefutable and irritating arguments that have embarrassed the status quo. So we appreciate what you're doing there. Be sure to visit. To visit our different websites, of course, chrismartzweather.com, climateataglance.com, where we've got factual rebuttals, climaterealism.com, where we slice and dice the media on a daily basis, energyataglance.com, Linnea's website, talking about all different kinds of energy, how it's created, and so forth and so on. And of course, my website, whatsupwiththat.com, the biggest climate website in the world. Thank you all for joining us today. I hope you have a great Friday and a fantastic weekend. Bye-bye.
Thanks for having me.
He's a lion, dog-faced pony soldier.